The clock struck midnight, and the wind howled through the empty halls of Hensley Manor, whispering secrets no one dared to speak. A single candle flickered on the grand oak desk, its feeble light dancing over the blood-stained letter, the final words of a man who had uncovered too much. Outside the storm raged, but inside a far deadlier storm was brewing. Someone in this house knew the truth. Someone had killed to keep it buried, and before the night was over, someone else would die. The morning in St. Mary Mead unfolded under a deceptive veil of tranquility, the golden light of dawn spilling over rooftops and hedgerows as the distant toll of church bells wove through the crisp air like a whispered warning. Miss Jane Marlowe, a woman whose sharp eyes had seen the ebb and flow of the village's quiet rhythm for decades, sat in the solitude of her well-kept garden, hands expertly working through the weeds while her mind remained ever alert, sifting through the unseen patterns of life around her. The village stirred to life in its unhurried way, birdsong lacing the air, the creak of cartwheels echoing through narrow lanes, the occasional murmur of early risers exchanging pleasantries, but beneath it all, an undercurrent of something unseen, something stirring in the shadows, pulsed through the air like an unsung melody. It was not the typical day in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marlowe sensed it long before the arrival of Dolly Bantry, whose swift, purposeful footsteps approached from beyond the garden gate. Dolly, ever the harbinger of news, though seldom of the comforting kind, arrived basket in hand, her usual exuberance tinged with something else this morning, something more urgent. "Jane, you wouldn't believe what's come up now," she declared, setting down the basket with a flourish, her bright smile a thin veil over the excitement in her voice. "Hensley Manor, Sir Alister Cranbourne's estate, is buzzing with secrets again." Miss Marlowe, her expression impassive but her interest quietly piqued, gestured for Dolly to sit. "Isn't it always?" she replied, wiping the earth from her hands and settling into her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Oh, but this time it's different," Dolly insisted, leaning in as if the very air held ears. "There's talk of a gathering, a secret society meeting, no less. The Veritas Society, they call themselves, important men, men of influence, but not a whisper of it in the papers. They've been arriving at the manor, under cover of darkness, slipping through the gates like ghosts." Miss Marlowe's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, her mind already assembling the pieces. A secret society in a place as quaint as St. Mary Mead. Unlikely, yet not impossible. "And what do they seek to hide, I wonder?" she mused, voice laced with a quiet amusement that belied the sharpness of her intrigue. "That's just it," Dolly whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if fearing unseen listeners. "No one knows. But Sir Alister's been keeping that house locked up tighter than ever. There's something behind those walls, Jane, something people aren't supposed to see." The wind stirred, rustling the ivy along the garden fence as if nature itself conspired to add weight to Dolly's words. Miss Marlowe, ever the observer, let silence stretch between them, waiting for the pieces to settle before speaking. "Perhaps," she said finally, setting her teacup down with deliberate care, "we should see for ourselves." Dolly's eyes widened with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Oh, Jane, I thought you'd never suggest it. But promise me one thing," she added, lowering her voice. "If we're going to step into that house, we do it carefully. There's something about Sir Alister, something that doesn't sit right." Miss Marlowe's lips curled into the faintest smile, a knowing glint in her gaze. "My dear Dolly," she murmured, "it's always the quiet ones who have the most to hide." And as the bells tolled once more, their steady chime a reminder of time's relentless march forward, the village continued in its placid way, unaware that behind the doors of Hensley Manor, a mystery awaited, its secrets woven into the very walls, whispering, watching, waiting. The morning in St. Mary Mead was as peaceful as ever, soft sunlight stretching over rooftops and narrow lanes, the air still carrying traces of the night's rain. The church bells tolled in the distance, their sound drifting lazily through the village, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Miss Eleanor Graves knelt in the quiet corner of her garden, her fingers deftly pulling out weeds, her sharp eyes studying the damp earth as if searching for a hidden truth. Her face, as always, carried a serene expression, but there was a quiet intensity in her gaze, an unspoken awareness of something stirring beneath the surface. But this morning was not as ordinary as it seemed. The wind carried an unfamiliar edge, a whisper of something unseen, and then the quiet was broken by a familiar sound, Dolly Harrington's hurried footsteps crunching against the gravel path. She never walked without urgency, though she often seemed uncertain of the reason. "Eleanor, I had to find you," she announced, her voice breathless with excitement, "and I think you'll want to hear this." Miss Graves dusted her hands off on her apron, and looked up at her old friend with an amused expression. "You always bring news before the morning has properly settled. Go on then, what is it this time?" Dolly stepped closer, lowering her voice as if the village itself might be listening. "It's Sir Malcolm Ashford, you know, the owner of Hensley House." Eleanor gave a slow knowing nod. Dolly continued, her voice tinged with something between curiosity and suspicion. "He's been having visitors, strange ones, people who don't belong in a quiet village like ours, and it's all tied to some kind of secret society. They call it the Ashen Circle." Miss Graves sat still, absorbing the name. "And what exactly is the Ashen Circle?" she asked, her voice calm, yet laced with a deeper curiosity. Dolly leaned in, glancing over her shoulder before speaking again. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's just a gathering of intellectuals, but I don't believe that for a second. These meetings happen late at night, and Eleanor, the kind of people showing up at Hensley House, they don't belong in places where secrets stay hidden for long." Eleanor finally stood, brushing the soil from her hands, her gaze fixed on the garden gate as though expecting an unseen visitor. "Many things appear harmless at first glance, Dolly. But sometimes," she paused, her voice carrying an air of foreboding, "sometimes they aren't." Dolly's eyes brightened with intrigue. "So you agree that this isn't just some harmless club?" Eleanor allowed a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "I only mean that Sir Malcolm has always been a man who plays his cards carefully, and if his guests are truly as unusual as you say, then perhaps it's worth looking into what's really going on behind those grand doors." Dolly exhaled sharply, torn between excitement and unease. "But Eleanor, I have a feeling this is just the beginning, and I don't like how this morning, so peaceful and ordinary, suddenly feels like the start of something much, much bigger." Miss Graves' expression did not change, but a quiet gleam appeared in her eyes. "Mornings rarely end the way they begin, Dolly. And as for this Ashen Circle, whatever they're hiding, I have a feeling it's not meant to stay hidden forever." The church bells rang once more, their echoes stretching across the village like a memory trying to resurface. This was no ordinary rumor, this was something deeper, like a story still being written, its ending yet unknown. The village of Ashworth Hollow had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where the past clung to the present like ivy on an old stone wall. But something had changed. The morning air carried a weight, a hush, as though the village itself was waiting for something to shatter its stillness. Miss Eleanor Graves stood at her garden gate, her keen eyes studying the cobbled streets that stretched into the misty horizon. It was a morning like any other, or at least it should have been. But then came the hurried footsteps, the sound of someone moving with purpose. A figure emerged from the fog, small but determined, with an energy that disrupted the fragile peace. "Eleanor," called Dolly Harrington, breathless with urgency, "you need to hear this." Miss Graves turned, her expression unreadable but attentive. "You always bring the most interesting news, Dolly. What is it this time?" Dolly leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper as though the hedges might be listening. "It's about Lord Edwin Blackwood. He's been hosting visitors at Holloway Manor, strange ones, people who don't belong here." Her lips pursed with suspicion. "And there's talk of a society, something called the Obsidian Order. The name settled in the air like a shadow. Miss Graves's fingers tightened around the wrought iron gate. "And what exactly is the Obsidian Order?" she asked, her tone mild but laced with an undertone of intrigue. Dolly exhaled sharply. "No one knows, no one's seen them in town, and yet the house is always lit at odd hours. Last night, just before midnight, I saw a carriage arrive. The passengers wore dark cloaks, their faces hidden." Her voice dropped lower. "And then, Eleanor, there was a scream. Faint but unmistakable." Miss Graves remained still, absorbing the details. "Did anyone else hear it?" Dolly shook her head. "If they did, they're pretending they didn't. But that's not all. There's a woman too, Isabella Leclerc." She hesitated. "A foreigner, beautiful, in that way that makes people uneasy. Dark hair, piercing eyes. She's been seen with Lord Blackwood, and people are whispering that she's the reason for all of this." Miss Graves finally moved, lifting her teacup to her lips, though she did not drink. "And you believe there's more to it?" Dolly's expression darkened. "I don't believe in coincidences, Eleanor. A secret society, a mysterious woman, and Lord Blackwood, who, let's be honest, has never been the most trustworthy man." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden sharp sound, a cry, high and distant, slicing through the heavy morning air. A woman came rushing down the street, her pale face contorted with fear. It was one of the maids from Holloway Manor. She stumbled, caught herself, then gasped out the words that turned the quiet village into a storm of whispers. "Lord Blackwood, he's dead, murdered in his own study." The words sent a ripple of shock through the village. A death was one thing, but murder, that was something Ashworth Hollow was not prepared for. Dolly turned to Miss Graves, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, you don't think—" Miss Graves's gaze was distant, thoughtful. The morning had started with rumors, but now it had turned into something much darker. "Dolly," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "I believe it's time we paid a visit to Holloway Manor. Because something tells me this isn't just an unfortunate accident." The village seemed to hold its breath. The fog clung to the streets, as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. But Miss Graves had a feeling that whatever secrets were hidden behind those grand doors, they were about to come spilling out, whether the Obsidian Order wanted them to or not. The evening mist clung to the edges of Ravensbrook Manor, a towering relic of another era, its ivy-clad walls whispering secrets in the cold wind. Eleanor Graves, known for her sharp wit and sharper instincts, stepped past the wrought iron gates, her gloved fingers brushing against the metal as if sensing the weight of the history within. The village had been uneasy for weeks, whispers of strange figures moving in the dead of night, the sound of footsteps where none should be, and now the chilling climax, a body found in the manor's grand study. Lord Hawthorne, the reclusive master of the house, was discovered slumped over his desk, a glass of brandy untouched beside him, his lifeless eyes fixed on a half-burned letter in the fireplace. No forced entry, no obvious wounds, yet the look on his face was one of pure horror. As Eleanor surveyed the room, the thick scent of aged wood, and something faintly acrid filled her lungs, a hidden truth lurking beneath the polished surface. The villagers who had gathered outside held their breath as Constable Merrick exchanged nervous glances with his deputy. "No sign of struggle," he murmured, his voice taut with unease. But Eleanor knew better. Murder was rarely loud. It was a patient thing, creeping in the shadows, waiting for its moment. A single candle flickered on the desk, casting erratic shapes on the walls, and just as her eyes settled on an overturned inkwell, something stirred in the farthest corner of the room. A whisper of movement, a presence unseen yet undeniably there. The air grew thick, the very house seemed to hold its breath, and in that instant, Eleanor knew, this was no ordinary crime. This was a message. The village of Blackthorn was restless, its cobbled streets humming with whispers as dusk draped the land in a shroud of uneasy silence. The towering silhouette of Evermore Hall stood against the fading light, its stone facade weathered by time, its ivy-choked walls whispering forgotten secrets to the wind. Eleanor Vale moved through the iron gates, unnoticed by most, save for the few villagers who exchanged furtive glances, their fear palpable. The estate loomed ahead, its great oak doors standing ajar like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside the air was thick, heavy with something metallic and damp, the unmistakable scent of death, interwoven with the age-old aroma of polished wood and old paper. Lord Benedict Hawthorne, a man whose name carried weight far beyond these lands, had been found slumped over his grand mahogany desk only hours before, his body still, his fingers locked in rigor around a half-burnt page, its edges curled, blackened as if yanked from the flames in a moment of desperation. No sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, not a single shattered pane of glass, only an unnatural stillness that clung to the room, wrapping itself around Eleanor like a second skin. A single candle flickered in the far corner, its wax dripping in slow, deliberate trails down the brass holder, untouched, as if time itself had stalled in the very moment of his demise. The grand chandelier above gleamed ominously, reflecting the crimson stains spreading beneath the dead man's chest, a grotesque flower blooming against the fine fabric of his waistcoat. The inspector's boots thudded against the marble as he entered, his sharp gaze sweeping the study like a predator scenting its quarry. He was a man of rules, of conclusions drawn too hastily, of cases solved before they had truly begun. But Eleanor saw more, the ink droplet on the desk's corner, too precisely placed to be an accident, the thin groove in the wooden floor near the bookcase, as if something heavy had been moved. And then there was the feeling, subtle but undeniable, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting, holding on to a secret they dared not reveal. A draught swept through the hallway beyond, rattling the great clock in the corridor, its chimes hollow, echoing in the vast emptiness of the manor. The door groaned as it shut behind her, sealing her inside this house of silence and sin, and in that moment, Eleanor knew, this was no simple murder, no random act of violence. This was a message. Someone had left a trail, and it was meant to be found. But the real question remained, had she arrived in time, or was she already too late? The great halls of Ashcombe Manor were cloaked in an unsettling stillness, the air thick with the kind of silence that made even the ticking of the grand clock sound accusatory. The body of Lord Edgar Blackwood sat slumped over his vast walnut desk, his lifeless fingers frozen in place, a single sheet of parchment beneath his unmoving hand, the ink smeared as if interrupted mid-thought. A dagger, old yet pristine, was embedded deep into his chest, its hilt gleaming under the flickering candlelight, as though proud of its ghastly work. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture, only the lingering scent of aged paper, wax and something far more coppery. Inspector Harrow stood in the doorway, his silhouette rigid against the study's dim glow, his face carved from years of hardened experience, yet something in his stance betrayed an unease. He had encountered locked-room murders before, but none quite like this. Across from him, Eleanor Sterling stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped together, her expression composed but unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss," Harrow muttered, his voice gruff but void of warmth. "But I must ask, how did it happen?" Eleanor turned her gaze toward him, slow and deliberate, her voice steady as a still lake. "I don't know," she said. "He was in his study all evening, as he always was. I was in the East Wing. When I finally came to check on him, it was already too late." Harrow exhaled, his eyes flickering toward the single window, bolted shut, and the door, locked from the inside. She nodded once. Yes, he never liked to be disturbed while working. A small, almost imperceptible flicker passed through her expression, gone before it could be grasped. "It was the housemaid who found him first. She ran to me screaming." Harrow's lips pressed into a hard line, his gaze shifting toward Eleanor, with the quiet scrutiny of a man who had learned to distrust even the simplest answers. But it wasn't just her composure that intrigued him, it was the way she avoided looking at the desk. "No one else in the house heard anything," he pressed. "No unusual sounds, nothing," she said smoothly. but there was something too measured about the way she spoke. He cast a sidelong glance at the other observer in the room, Veronica Hale, the woman who had arrived uninvited yet managed to make herself indispensable in cases like these. She was watching Eleanor with the same quiet curiosity, her gaze unwavering, sharp as a scalpel. A locked door, no sign of a struggle, Veronica mused, her voice featherlight, yet laced with something far heavier. And yet, something feels unfinished, doesn't it? A faint tension pulled at the corners of Eleanor's mouth. I wouldn't know, she said, but Veronica did. She always did. The weight of the study pressed in around them, the scent of parchment, of leather-bound books, of something unspoken lurking beneath the surface. The polished mahogany shelves towered over them, a silent jury bearing witness to the scene. Harrow stepped forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the desk. The parchment beneath Blackwood's lifeless hand was creased, a single word smudged as if he had tried to write something in his last moment. The ink, still damp, the message incomplete. And then there was the dagger itself, antique, ornate, far too ceremonial for a crime of passion. A statement piece, not a weapon of convenience. Quite the scene, Harrow muttered under his breath. Veronica merely tilted her head. Indeed, she said, but I suspect it isn't quite finished yet. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, despite the locks holding firm. Somewhere in the distance, the great clock struck the hour, its chimes hollow against the weight of the room's silence. The truth was here, waiting to be unearthed. But as Veronica took in the minute details, the lingering air of something unfinished, she couldn't help but wonder, had they arrived just in time to solve a murder, or had they merely stepped into a story already set in motion, where the real ending had yet to unfold? Inspector Graves stood with his hands on his hips, exhaling sharply as his gaze swept across the room. The door, the window, even the damned chimney, no sign of forced entry. His voice carried an undercurrent of frustration. Miss Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a few measured steps forward, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail the ones most would ignore. The air in the room was thick, unmoving as though it hadn't been disturbed for hours. As she passed the desk, a faint scent caught her attention. Lavender, strange. Sir Leopold Palmer was a man of cigars and scotch, not soft fragrances. It was an anomaly so subtle it could have gone unnoticed, but Eleanor knew better. It didn't belong. Her gaze drifted to the desk. A glass of whiskey sat undisturbed on the corner, perfectly still, as if it had been placed there long before death came calling. No condensation clung to the rim, no smudges or hurried fingerprints. And then something else. Near the edge of the desk, barely catching the light, was a torn piece of parchment. She crouched, fingers brushing against its jagged edges, careful, as though the slightest touch might erase a crucial clue. The ink had blurred, the words fragmented, but one stood out just enough to make her pulse quicken. "Veritas," she murmured. Graves picked up on it instantly. "You recognize the handwriting?" His voice was skeptical. Eleanor shook her head. "No, not the handwriting. The name." Her frown deepened. "Veritas. It's a society, a secretive one. I've heard whispers of it before, but no one ever speaks of it openly." Graves scowled. "Great. Another mystery on top of this one." Eleanor had already moved to the window, her fingers testing the latch. Locked. Secure. Just as Graves had said. The crime scene was impeccable, too impeccable. No sign of struggle, no sign of escape. She turned back, surveying the room again. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, the furniture arranged with meticulous precision, everything in its place. And yet the tension in the air was palpable. Something had happened here, something calculated. Graves, growing restless, yanked at the door handle, locked from the inside. The key still in place. No way in, no way out. A perfect crime scene. Too perfect. Eleanor said quietly, her gaze flickering back to the desk. Her attention returned to the glass of whiskey, an unease settling in her chest. It hadn't been touched, but it was too cold to have been poured recently. The glass, she murmured, fingers ghosting over its rim. It hasn't been disturbed, but it's been here for hours. Graves studied her, rubbing his jaw. You think the killer left it there? Eleanor glanced at him, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. It's possible, but more likely, it was meant to soothe him, to make him feel at ease before the final act. Graves exhaled sharply, which means whoever did this had control over him. They had to be close. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead she glanced once more at the torn parchment, then back at the body. Sir Leopold Palmer had been a man of influence, of carefully guarded secrets. He hadn't built his empire by being careless. Whoever had orchestrated this had done so with precision, with patience. This was no crime of passion, it was a design, a game. And if there was one thing Eleanor knew for certain, it was this: murder was never as simple as it seemed. The heavy silence in the drawing room was suffocating, thick with unspoken truths and veiled glances. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as if the walls had absorbed the weight of the crime and now held their breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. Lady Eleanor sat near the window, her hands moving rhythmically over her embroidery, though her mind was far from the simple pattern her fingers traced. She was watching, studying, reading the room the way a seasoned hunter tracks its prey. Each subtle shift of posture, each hesitant glance, each moment of stillness spoke louder than words. Everyone gathered here had something to hide, some more than others, and in a room filled with carefully constructed facades, it was the smallest of cracks that revealed the deepest truths. Inspector Graves stood in the center, his stance rigid, his eyes like sharpened steel, as they swept across the gathered suspects. "No one leaves until we have answers," he declared, his voice steady, but edged with something deeper, an impatience, perhaps even a touch of suspicion, that went beyond mere duty. His presence was commanding, but Eleanor knew that the real work of catching a killer did not lie in authority alone. It lay in observation, in patience, in letting people believe they were safe in their lies until, inevitably, they unraveled. Lady Beatrice Lancaster, ever poised, was the first to speak. "I was in my room when it happened," she said, her voice cool, composed, but Eleanor caught the slight tremor in her fingers as they curled against the fabric of the armrest. A leather-bound book rested in her lap, its spine uncreased, the pages pristine. She had claimed to have been reading it, yet not a single page had been turned. Eleanor noticed this instantly, but said nothing, yet, instead she allowed a small knowing smile to touch her lips. "A fascinating read, I'm sure," she murmured, her voice light, almost amused. Beatrice hesitated, just a fraction too long, before forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Yes," she replied, "a most engrossing story," but her hands betrayed her, pressing the book too tightly against her lap. Graves, oblivious to the silent exchange, turned his focus to the next suspect. "Professor Ambrose Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "You had a disagreement with Lord Ashford concerning Veritas. Care to explain?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. The candlelight cast sharp shadows on his angular face, deepening the furrow in his brow. His fingers were wrapped around his glass of brandy, but the drink remained untouched. "Yes, we disagreed," he admitted after a long pause, his voice clipped. "But intellectual discourse is not a motive for murder, Inspector." His eyes flicked toward the others, quick, calculating, as if measuring how much he could afford to say. "Lord Ashford and I saw Veritas through very different lenses. He believed it should remain a mere discussion society, a place for ideas. I believed it could be something more." "More?" Graves prompted, his gaze unrelenting. "A means of influence," Caldwell said at last, his tone measured. "A tool for power, if you will. But disagreement does not mean I killed him." Graves remained silent for a moment, then spoke evenly. "Discourse rarely leaves a man dead in a locked room, Professor." Caldwell stiffened, pressing his lips together. "No, it does not. Then there was Colonel Montague, his crisp uniform at odds with the restless drumming of his fingers against the armrest. He had the bearing of a man used to command, yet there was something frayed beneath the surface, something barely restrained. His eyes were sharp, alert, yet his hands betrayed him. Eleanor knew that kind of tension well, the tension of a man who had seen things he could not forget, who carried burdens he could never name. Graves turned to him. "Colonel, where were you at the time of the murder?" Montague met his gaze head-on. "In my quarters, alone." "Can anyone confirm that?" Montague exhaled slowly. "No." Silence. The kind that stretched too long, weighed too heavily. Eleanor glanced at the fireplace, the embers still faintly glowing. The scent of burnt paper lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. A letter, perhaps, a document someone had been desperate to destroy. Her eyes flicked to the study door, the brass handle gleaming in the dim light. It was locked from the inside when they found Lord Ashford. No sign of forced entry, no sign of exit. The perfect locked room mystery. Except perfection was an illusion, there were always cracks. The untouched glass of whiskey, the torn parchment with that single ominous word Veritas. It wasn't just a society, it was a secret worth killing for. The question wasn't just who had the most to gain, but who had orchestrated this with such precision that they believed they had left no loose ends. But Eleanor knew better. There were always loose ends. And it was in those frayed, overlooked threads that she would find the truth. The air in the grand drawing room of Blackthorn Manor was thick with tension, a silence stretched so tightly that it felt on the verge of shattering. The chandelier cast flickering light over the polished mahogany table, its glow reflecting in the eyes of the assembled guests, each a portrait of controlled nerves, each hiding something beneath their carefully arranged expressions. Inspector Harrington stood at the center, a man with clear ideas and little patience for those who did not share them, his piercing gaze sweeping over the room like a razor, his voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the heavy quiet. "You have all spoken of Veritas, a society meant to be a force for good. But what happens when power outgrows purpose?" His eyes locked onto Colonel Bain, whose stiff posture and proud bearing belied the unease in his clenched jaw. "Colonel, you've been a strong proponent of Veritas. Would you care to explain its true purpose?" Bain's chest puffed out slightly at the challenge, his voice unwavering. "Veritas exists to right the wrongs of this world, to bring justice where the law fails." Yet there was something rehearsed in his tone, too precise, too polished. Sir Alistair was instrumental in shaping it, but lately his failure to maintain discipline, a pause, a hesitation. Well, let's just say it was disappointing. A flicker of shadow passed through his expression, and he quickly added, "But that does not mean—" He stopped, his tone turning sharp. "It does not mean I would resort to violence." Harrington raised a skeptical brow. "Of course, Colonel, but even the most honorable man, given the right provocation, might act rashly." Bain stiffened, his fingers curling against his palm, his silence more telling than any confession. Across the room, Isabella Ferreira leaned against the fireplace, her presence an enigma in itself. She had been silent until now, her dark eyes gleaming with a quiet amusement as she studied the unfolding scene. When Harrington's gaze fell on her, she tilted her head ever so slightly, a cryptic smile curving her lips. "And you, Miss Ferreira, you've been unusually quiet." Her voice, smooth as silk yet as unreadable as the sea, carried through the room. "I came to settle old debts." The words were simple, yet laced with something deeper, something unspoken. "Sir Alistair and I had unfinished business." Lady Eleanor, seated near the window, knitting needles resting idly in her lap, raised an eyebrow. "Unfinished business, that sounds rather ominous." Ferreira's smile remained, but something flickered in her gaze, something cold, something calculated. "Some things in life," she murmured, "are not meant to be forgotten." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Then there was Charlotte Whittaker, standing near the door, hands twisting together in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice came in a rush. "I prepared the study for him," she stammered, her words tumbling out too quickly. "I arranged the papers, set up his things, but I didn't stay long, I left early. He was fine, he didn't say anything unusual." The nervousness in her tone was unmistakable, but beneath it was something else. Not just fear, guilt. Harrington narrowed his eyes. "Are you certain? No strange sounds, no argument?" Charlotte swallowed hard. "No, I didn't hear anything. I just left." But Lady Eleanor was watching her closely, her mind moving faster than her hands. The girl was lying. It was in the way she held herself too rigidly, in the flicker of her gaze as she avoided meeting anyone's eyes. And then there was the Colonel, too quick to defend Veritas. Ferreira, too smooth in her deflections, the weight of deception pressed against the very walls of Blackthorn Manor. The truth was there, buried beneath words and silence alike, waiting to be uncovered. And Lady Eleanor had all the time in the world to find it. The door to Greystone's post office creaked as Eleanor Hathaway stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the worn wooden floor, her presence as unassuming as the old building itself. A scent of aged paper and dried ink hung in the air, mingling with the faint musk of dust and polished oak, the kind of smell that settled into a place over decades, becoming as much a part of it as the walls themselves. Behind the counter, Mr. Edgar Finch, the postmaster, was sorting through a stack of letters, his round glasses balanced precariously at the edge of his nose. The gentle murmur of conversation from the back room and the distant creak of shifting wood filled the silence between them. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," Eleanor greeted lightly, her voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." He looked up from his work, his expression brightening slightly. "Miss Hathaway, not at all. Always a pleasure. What can I do for you today?" She settled into one of the worn leather chairs by the counter, placing her small knitting bag beside her. Her fingers, as always, moved with quiet precision, pulling out a delicate piece of work, but her true purpose had little to do with knitting. "I was just wondering, Mr. Finch," she began casually, her needles clicking softly. "I've heard quite a bit about the Order of St. James, the society Lord Ashford was involved with. Seems they had quite the presence here in Greystone." At the mention of the name, Finch's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. He hesitated for only a second before carefully placing a bundle of letters aside. "So you've heard about them," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, more measured. "Not surprising, I suppose. The order has been around longer than most people realize, though it isn't often spoken about." Eleanor glanced up from her knitting, her expression mild but her gaze sharp. "Oh, I imagine there are plenty of things that go unspoken in a village like this." Finch's fingers drummed lightly against the counter before he sighed, casting a quick glance toward the window as if ensuring no curious ears lingered outside. When he spoke again, it was just above a whisper. "The order was founded on the idea that those with power, real power, ought to take responsibility for shaping the world around them, to enforce their own sense of order, their own justice." His lips pressed into a thin line. There were whispers, of course, about their methods, that sometimes the law wasn't enough, that sometimes people disappeared. Eleanor's knitting never faltered, but there was something keen in her eyes, a hunter who had caught the scent of something deeper. "It's a noble notion, isn't it? Justice. But I do wonder," she mused, "who decides what is just?" Finch hesitated again, shifting uneasily, his gaze flickering toward the back of the shop before he leaned in slightly. "For years they kept the village in check, wealthy men, influential families, men like Lord Ashford. But Ashford, he changed. He started questioning things, started speaking of reform, of exposing those who had gone too far." Eleanor's knitting paused for a fraction of a second, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. And then she murmured, "He was dead." Finch exhaled slowly. And then he was dead. Silence settled between them, heavy with the weight of things unspoken. He was planning to reveal something, Finch added at last, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Something that would have put the Order in a very dangerous light. There are those who would have done anything to keep that from happening. Eleanor's fingers rested lightly on the ball of yarn in her lap as she turned her gaze toward the postmaster, unreadable, thoughtful. And you believe someone in the Order, one of their own, had him silenced? Finch swallowed, his eyes flickering toward the shadows at the back of the shop, as though half expecting to find someone lurking there. I do. I can't prove it, but I do. Eleanor's needles resumed their steady rhythm, the faint clicking the only sound between them. A murder to protect a secret, she murmured. It's a tale as old as time, isn't it? Finch's fingers tightened around the letters on the counter, his knuckles whitening. If justice was truly their goal, she continued, why the secrecy, why the fear? He hesitated before shaking his head. Perhaps they thought if they kept it hidden, they could continue their work, that no one would question them. Eleanor gave the faintest of smiles, though it never quite reached her eyes. Or perhaps, she mused, they feared that the truth once exposed would undo everything they had built. The post office felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything unsaid. Eleanor Hathaway knew secrets when she saw them, and Greystone was full of them. She gathered her knitting, rising with the same unhurried grace she always carried, her thoughts already turning, the threads of truth beginning to weave together in her mind. The hunt, after all, had only just begun. A deep and eerie silence had settled over Colonel Harrington's study, the kind that sent shivers down one's spine. He was an aging yet formidable man, his eyes always carrying a certain sharpness, as if guarding a secret. But tonight there was something different in them. Fear. A quiet rustling echoed through the long corridors of the manor, followed by a pause. Outside, the rain fell in slow, steady drops, but inside, an unsettling stillness hung in the air. Then a crash, a scream, the sharp clatter of a chair hitting the floor, and silence once more. The next morning, Inspector Faraday stood at the entrance of Harrington Manor, accompanied by Mary Langley, a woman with keen eyes and a sharper mind, always drawn to mysteries that needed unraveling. Inside the study, they found Colonel Harrington's lifeless body slumped over his desk, his hand gripping a letter so tightly it seemed as though he had refused to let go even in death. But the strangest detail, the door was locked from the inside, and the large study window was bolted shut. How had the killer escaped? Inspector Faraday scanned the room, but Mary's attention was immediately drawn to the library shelf. One book was missing, its absence glaringly out of place. She knelt beside the thick carpet, noticing a small patch of soil, just a single spot, undisturbed elsewhere. Someone was here, she murmured. Faraday exhaled heavily. But how, with no way in or out? Mary merely smiled, her mind already piecing the puzzle together. She reached for an old book on the shelf, one that seemed far too important to be gathering dust. As she opened it, a brittle yellowed letter slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Its contents sent a chill down her spine. You may try to bury your secrets, Colonel, but how long before they rise again? Inspector Faraday picked it up, his brow furrowing. This looks like an old grudge, he said, or perhaps a long-forgotten conspiracy, Mary countered, a strange glint in her eye. Their footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors as they prepared to unravel the locked room mystery. But little did they know, they weren't just solving a murder, they were about to uncover a truth buried in darkness for far longer than Colonel Harrington had been dead. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling the ancient windows of Ravenswood Manor, a place steeped in shadows and whispers of secrets long buried. Detective Evelyn Harrow stepped cautiously onto the frost-bitten grounds, her sharp eyes scanning the grand estate's towering silhouette against the storm-lit sky. She had received an anonymous letter, a cryptic warning about the disappearance of Lord Ambrose Blackwell, a man known for his wealth, his enemies, and his unrelenting obsession with uncovering the manor's hidden past. The servants whispered of strange noises in the dead of night, books shifting on their own in the vast library, and a faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in empty rooms. Yet, the most peculiar detail was the locked study, bolted from the inside, where Lord Ambrose had last been seen, the only sign of disturbance a single shattered pane of glass upon the snow-dusted ground below. Evelyn bent down, picking up the shard with gloved fingers, its edges unnaturally clean, as if placed there deliberately. She turned to Inspector Hale, who stood brooding beside her. "The glass fell outward," she murmured, her breath curling into the frigid air. "But if he was inside when it broke, then how did he vanish?" Hale's expression darkened as he followed her gaze to the undisturbed snow. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, only the oppressive silence of the manor looming over them. As they entered the house, the candlelight flickered against the wood-paneled walls, and Evelyn felt it instantly. Something was watching. The study was untouched, save for Lord Ambrose's unfinished drink still resting on the desk beside an open ledger filled with frantic scribbles. The passage exists, beneath the hearth. The truth is waiting, but so is he. A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine. She had seen desperation in a dead man's words before, but this was terror. Her fingers traced the edge of the fireplace, feeling for inconsistencies, until, click, the hearth groaned, shifting forward by mere inches to reveal a black void beyond. Inspector Hale inhaled sharply. "A hidden passage," he muttered. But Evelyn wasn't looking at the passage anymore. She was staring at the mirror above the mantel, at the faint outline of a shadow that didn't belong to either of them. Then a whisper, a breath, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come." The candle flames trembled, the shadows deepened, and for the first time in her long career, Evelyn Harrow felt the weight of something far more chilling than mere human deception. The manor was hiding more than secrets. It was hiding something that should have never been found. The carriage trundled through the rain-slicked streets, its wheels slicing through the mist that clung to the cobbled roads like a ghostly shroud. The sky, bruised with storm clouds, loomed over Blackthorn Manor, its towering spires vanishing into the encroaching darkness. Detective Eleanor Graves tightened her cloak against the biting wind. As she stepped onto the gravel drive, the crunch beneath her boots swallowed by the distant howl of the storm. Blackthorn Manor stood in defiant silence, its grand facade betraying no emotion, yet she felt its presence like a watchful sentinel, a house steeped in the weight of untold secrets. The great iron gates, veined with rust, groaned open as if reluctant to grant her passage, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The butler, a gaunt, solemn figure, wordlessly led her through the labyrinthine hallways, their high ceilings and dark-paneled walls, swallowing the candlelight, casting restless shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. It was not simply a house of wealth, it was a house of history, of burdens, of something else, something unseen yet palpable. She was ushered into the drawing room, where Lady Genevieve Blackthorn sat poised by the fire, her silhouette stark against the flickering glow. The widow's gown, black as midnight, clung to her with an almost spectral grace, her delicate fingers curled around a glass of amber liquid. She did not rise, instead her sharp, knowing eyes met Eleanor's with a quiet challenge. "Detective Graves," she murmured, her voice smooth yet laced with something guarded. "I assume you've come with questions." Eleanor took a seat opposite her, the velvet upholstery cool beneath her fingertips, her senses keenly aware of every tick of the nearby grandfather clock. "Only a few," she replied, her tone deliberately unassuming. "But something tells me you already have answers." Lady Genevieve gave the smallest of smiles, one that did not reach her eyes. The silence between them stretched, as thick and heavy as the storm pressing against the manor's walls. "Secrets," the widow finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "have a way of unraveling when left untended. My husband understood that all too well." Eleanor watched her closely, and yet he seemed rather eager to reveal one of his own before he died. The fire crackled, throwing erratic shapes onto the walls, and for a fleeting moment, the room felt smaller, suffocating. "Whatever Henry was planning," Lady Genevieve said, tightening her grip on her glass, "he didn't live long enough to see it through." "How unfortunate," Eleanor murmured, tilting her head slightly. "And yet I can't help but wonder, was it truly unfinished, or was it taken from him before he could act?" A slight tremor passed through the widow's fingers, a reaction so swift and controlled that most would have missed it. But Eleanor didn't. "You think I know more than I'm saying. I think," Eleanor said, voice quiet but unwavering, "that everyone in this house is carrying a burden. The question is whose is heavy enough to kill for." The grandfather clock chimed, its haunting toll vibrating through the very bones of the house. A shiver crawled up Eleanor's spine, not from the cold, but from the sense that she was brushing against something far darker than mere deception. Lady Genevieve exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable, her hands now folded neatly in her lap. "If you dig too deep, detective," she whispered, her words barely audible over the howling wind outside, "you may not like what you find." Then footsteps. Somewhere beyond the gilded doors, down the manor's hollow corridors, the unmistakable sound of deliberate, measured steps. Soft, unhurried, and entirely out of place. Eleanor turned her head slightly, listening. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Lady Evangeline's breath caught for just a moment, a flicker of something almost imperceptible in her steely gaze, but Miss Marlowe noticed it, the briefest hesitation, a fracture in the otherwise perfect mask of control. "You're wrong." Lady Evangeline's voice was steady, but there was something underneath, a carefully measured desperation. "Sir Alistair was a good man. He only wished to protect the family name, to shield us from scandal." Miss Marlowe leaned in slightly, her expression unreadable, but her voice laced with quiet certainty. "And what kind of scandal," she asked, "would have been too great for Sir Alistair to contain? Or perhaps, it's one you are still struggling to keep buried." The room was heavy now, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The fire crackled in the dimly lit parlor, its flickering glow casting restless shadows across the velvet curtains, the ornate woodwork, the perfectly poised Lady Evangeline, whose fingers just for a moment tightened ever so slightly on the delicate rim of her teacup. Then the mask was back, composed, unreadable. "I have nothing to hide," she said softly, her voice almost convincing. Nor did Sir Alistair. Later that evening Miss Marlowe took a solitary walk through the village square, the chill in the air sharpening her thoughts. The cobbled streets were slick with the remnants of a fading mist, and the distant chime of the old church bell marked the late hour. Her mind turned over the conversation again and again, sifting through the delicate threads of half-truths and omissions, and it was then, over a quiet cup of tea with Dolly Bantry, that she stumbled upon something unexpected. "Did you hear about Evangeline's brother?" Dolly leaned in, lowering her voice as though the very walls might be listening. "Edward, he was mixed up in some dreadful financial mess a few years back, shady dealings, embezzlement if you ask me. And Alistair, well, he made sure it never saw the light of day." A chill curled down Miss Marlowe's spine. So Sir Alistair had not merely been protecting a reputation, he had been covering for something. And not just anything, but something dangerous enough to demand silence. "It's one thing to protect your own," Dolly continued, voice hushed. "But when you start making deals to keep things buried, well, that's a different matter altogether." Miss Marlowe sat back, her fingers tapping lightly against the porcelain of her teacup, feeling the pieces fall into place. Lady Evangeline's carefully controlled reactions, the whispers of Veritas, the secretive society that had long been rumored to exist beneath the veneer of polite society, and now this. The question was no longer just about who had killed Sir Alistair, but what he had uncovered before he died. And whatever it was, it had been worth killing for. The village of Ravensmoor was known for its quiet, for its order, but tonight there was something else pressing against the silence, something unseen yet felt. The old stone inn, its wooden beams darkened with age and whispers, stood like a sentinel in the center of town, a place where secrets were traded in hushed voices over ale, and where the weight of history seemed to seep into the very walls. It was here, in a shadowed corner, that Miss Marlowe observed Professor Hugo Bellamy, tall, thin, his posture slightly hunched as though burdened by knowledge too heavy to carry. He sat alone, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his glass. He muttered to himself, eyes clouded with thought, a man tangled in a web of intellect and secrets. If anyone knew what Sir Alistair had discovered, it was him, and Miss Marlowe had no intention of leaving this night without an answer. She rose from her seat, her footsteps light against the worn floorboards. The fire in the hearth crackled, the scent of smoke and aged paper thick in the air, and as she approached, Professor Bellamy finally looked up. His eyes, sharp yet weary, flickered with something unreadable, and in that moment, Miss Marlowe knew he was afraid, not of her, but of what she was about to uncover. The night was thick with the kind of silence that suffocates, pressing down on the narrow mist-laden streets like a shroud. Inspector Graves pulled his hat down against the damp chill, his keen eyes locked onto the looming silhouette of St. Bede's library. The building stood like an ancient sentinel, its stone facade worn by time, its high-arched windows dark save for one, a dim flickering glow barely breaking through the fog. The old lamp-post at the entrance swayed in the wind, its light weak, casting long shivering shadows on the cobblestone path. Inside, Dr. Ambrose Wren sat hunched over a massive wooden desk, the weight of unseen burdens pulling at his already thin frame. His fingers, frail and lined with age, traced the delicate pages of an ancient tome, not just a book, but a confession, a testament written in ink and fear, whispering a story long buried beneath time's relentless tide. He turned each page with careful reverence, yet with each turn, his face paled further, his breath growing shallower. The dim candlelight did little to soften the hollowness in his sunken eyes. He wasn't merely reading, he was unraveling something that had been waiting to be uncovered. Graves stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor, his sharp gaze studying the scholar's every movement. There was an unease in the air, a tension woven into the very fabric of the dimly lit library. "You're afraid of something, Doctor," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. Wren flinched, ever so slightly, his bony hands tightening around the book's fragile spine. He kept his gaze low, refusing to meet Graves' eyes, as though afraid that the truth might spill from his lips if he so much as glanced in the inspector's direction. "You don't understand," Wren murmured at last, his voice paper-thin, barely carried by the air between them. "This isn't just about a murder, this is history, erased before it could ever be written. Sir Henshaw didn't just stumble upon something, he was seeking it, and that," he tapped the pages before him, his knuckles white with tension, "that is why he's dead." Graves studied the old man with the patience of a hunter, his mind already threading together the loose strands of this mystery. "If you want to tell me the truth, Doctor," he said quietly, "perhaps you should start by answering this. Was Sir Henshaw's death an accident, or was there a desperate hand guiding fate?" The candle flickered, casting sharp, dancing shadows across Wren's hollow features. He swallowed hard, the air between them growing heavier by the second. Sir Henshaw was close to something too close, a secret buried not just in these pages, but in the very foundation of this city, a truth that was never meant to be unearthed. If it came to light, it wouldn't just ruin a man's reputation, it would dismantle an entire legacy. Graves exhaled slowly, his sharp mind racing through the implications. "And is that secret still hidden, Doctor?" For the first time, Wren looked up, his gaze haunted, his lips trembling on the edge of an answer. And in that moment of silence, something unseen shifted, as if the very walls of the library were listening, holding their breath along with them. The inspector knew then, this was no ordinary crime. It was the prelude to something far greater, a story being unraveled, not by time, but by the hands of those who would do anything to keep it from ever being told. The air in the dimly lit study was thick with the scent of old books, polished wood, and something else, something faintly metallic, like the ghost of blood long since wiped away. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, throwing shifting shadows onto the walls, but even its warmth could not thaw the tension that hung between Inspector Alden Gray and Dr. Vincent Harrow. Harrow sat stiffly in his high-backed leather chair, his fingers drumming soundlessly against the armrest, his gaze flickering toward the heavy curtains that blocked out the night. He was a man accustomed to control, to certainty, but tonight, a thin thread of unease had woven itself into the fabric of his carefully composed demeanor. "You've been here before, Inspector," Harrow said at last, his voice smooth but edged with something brittle. "Twice now. I assume you've come with more than just idle speculation." Gray studied him with the patience of a man who had unraveled too many lies to be hurried. "Speculation, Doctor, is what happens when there are too many unknowns. But I have fewer of those now." He took a measured step closer to the desk, his gloved fingers brushing against its polished surface. "I know that Reginald Hensley was found dead in this very room. The door was locked from the inside, the window bolted. No sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle. An impossible crime, some might say." Harrow exhaled a whisper of frustration. "And yet, it happened. So tell me, Inspector, what new theory have you conjured this time?" Gray ignored the sarcasm. His gaze flicked toward the decanter of brandy on the side table, its level noticeably lower than it had been on his last visit. He reached for the crystal stopper, turning it between his fingers before setting it down again. "A locked room murder is only impossible if you assume the killer ever left." Harrow's fingers tightened on the armrest just slightly. "What are you suggesting?" The inspector reached into his pocket and withdrew a small length of twine, holding it up between them. Simple, yet effective. A knot tied just so, a mechanism so subtle it wouldn't even be noticed. With the right pull, a window latch can be drawn shut from the outside, giving the illusion of a sealed crime scene. He let the silence settle between them, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across Harrow's face. "But you already know that, don't you?" A muscle flickered in Harrow's jaw, but his expression remained impassive. "And if I did, that hardly means I had anything to do with Hensley's death." Gray tilted his head, his voice dropping to a murmur. "No, but it does mean you know who did, and that's what matters." He reached out and tapped the desk, right where a faint, discolored stain marred the wood, a stain so small that most would have missed it. "You were here that night, Doctor. You saw something, perhaps even heard something, and yet you said nothing." Harrow hesitated. The firelight caught the sheen of sweat just above his brow. Then finally, he exhaled, as if resigning himself to the inevitable. "I tried to stop it," he muttered. "But by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late." Gray's voice remained steady, but sharper now, like a blade pressing against truth. "Then tell me, who?" Harrow closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a shadow passing over his face, his throat bobbing with the weight of an answer he had long suppressed. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The one person who never needed a key." Gray's breath stilled, his mind racing ahead to a conclusion he had begun to suspect, but had not yet dared to name aloud. He had expected deception, expected evasion, but not this. The realization settled over him like a slow creeping fog. "Who are you protecting, Doctor?" His voice was softer now, almost coaxing, but Harrow only shook his head, his hands tightening into fists. "You don't understand," Harrow murmured, almost to himself. "You think you do, but you don't. Some truths are worse than the lie that buries them." Gray leaned forward, his presence looming now, the fire behind him casting his silhouette like that of a judge, a specter of justice itself. "Try me." Harrow hesitated, his breath shallow, as if teetering on the edge of something he had spent too long avoiding. The study seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the silence stretched, charged with something heavy, something inevitable. And then, with a voice weighed down by regret, he spoke the name. The room once so full of whispered secrets, suddenly felt as if it had exhaled, and Gray knew without a doubt that the true hunt had only just begun. A dense fog coiled around the grand estate of Blackthorn Manor, its tendrils seeping through the towering iron gates and curling against the cold stone walls. Inside, the study was suffocatingly still, the flickering light of a single oil lamp casting restless shadows across the heavy mahogany desk, the velvet-draped windows, and the corpse slumped in the high-backed chair. Sir Malcolm Everett had been murdered, his throat slit cleanly, the letter opener still gripped in his rigid fingers. The door was locked from the inside, the windows bolted shut, and the thick carpet bore no trace of an intruder's steps. An impossible crime. And yet, Inspector Rees-Adler knew there was no such thing. Across from him, Eleanor Vale stood with her hands lightly resting on the edge of the window frame, her gaze unwavering as she studied the shattered glass outside. "It was meant to mislead us," she murmured, her voice as calm as the midnight air. "To make us believe the killer came from outside, but the truth is simpler." She turned, meeting the inspector's eyes. "The killer never left." Adler's jaw tightened, his mind racing over the theory. The crime scene had been a masterpiece of deception, a locked room mystery crafted to perfection. "So they staged the break-in," he muttered, rubbing his temple as he pieced it together. "The broken glass, the snow outside undisturbed, a trick designed to make us look in the wrong direction." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, though there was no amusement in her expression. "Not just a trick, Inspector. A test. The murderer is watching us, waiting to see if we'll solve it." She stepped away from the window, crossing the study with slow, deliberate steps. Whoever did this knew this room intimately. They understood how to lock the door, how to make it appear as though no one could have escaped. It was never about committing the perfect crime. She exhaled softly, her voice almost a whisper. It was about proving that they were clever enough to get away with it. The inspector's eyes narrowed. He turned toward the bookshelves, his fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound volumes until they halted over a slight indentation on the shelf's edge. A hidden mechanism, a secret panel. "They never left," he murmured, pressing the spot. A faint click sounded, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway vanishing into darkness. Eleanor's breath hitched, her expression unreadable. "And now we know how they did it." Adler's grip on his revolver tightened. He had seen murderers before, calculating men, desperate men, men who killed out of rage or greed. But this was something different. The killer had orchestrated every detail with chilling precision, crafting a puzzle they believed no one could solve. But they had made a mistake. A shadow moved at the far end of the passage, a breath of movement barely perceptible in the gloom. Someone was still here, watching, waiting, and the game was only just beginning. The candlelight flickered against the dark-paneled walls of Blackthorn Hall's grand drawing room, its golden glow failing to dispel the shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners. The assembled guests sat in rigid silence, their eyes darting toward the lone figure standing by the fireplace, Charlotte Wren, her hands calmly clasped before her, her expression unreadable. The weight of her presence had an almost suffocating effect, a slow tightening of the air as if she were drawing an unseen noose around them all. "We are all here," she said finally, her voice as gentle as a whisper yet cutting as finely as a scalpel, "which means it is time to stop pretending." A shudder of unease passed through the group. Lady Rosalind's fingers gripped the arms of her chair. Beside her, Lord Everley sat unnaturally still, his gaze locked on the polished floor, as if searching for cracks to escape through. The others were just as tense. Dr. Mowbray, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Mr. Harland, adjusting his collar despite the cold. None of them spoke, but their silence was a confession in itself. Lord Blackthorn was not a man without enemies, Charlotte continued, pacing slowly across the room. Nor was he a man without secrets. But what makes this particular crime so fascinating is not the murder itself. No, that was simple, inevitable, even. Her gaze flicked to the shattered glass near the terrace doors, then to the thick drapes swaying slightly, despite the still air. The true genius lies in how it was staged. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the room. Charlotte turned her head slightly, allowing the moment to stretch, savoring the tension as if it were a fine wine. A locked room, no footprints in the snow beyond the terrace. The window shattered from the inside, yet appearing to suggest an intruder. A man stabbed, the weapon left deliberately in his hand as though he had done the deed himself. Her voice dipped lower, a puzzle crafted so intricately, so cleverly, that one might believe the murderer had vanished into thin air. A cold sweat glistened on Lord Everleigh's brow. "That's absurd," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Charlotte merely tilted her head. "Is it, or is it the only explanation that makes sense?" She moved toward the cabinet where the brandy had been poured hours before, her fingertips tracing the rim of an untouched glass. "The question is not how the killer entered, but why they wanted us to believe they ever did." She turned, her eyes locking onto the widow. "Lady Rosalind, you were the first to discover the body, but you were not the first to enter that room, were you?" A ripple of shock went through the room. Lady Rosalind's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the delicate lace of her sleeve. "I don't understand what you're implying." Charlotte smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you do." She took a measured step closer. "You were there when he died, weren't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked once, twice, each beat a hammer driving the inevitable toward them. "No," Lady Rosalind whispered, but her voice was too fragile, too thin to hold back the weight of truth pressing against her. Charlotte sighed. "I understand. You had no choice, did you? After all, he had threatened everything, your wealth, your family name, your carefully constructed world. You acted in desperation. But desperation has a way of leaving cracks." She gestured toward the shattered glass. "A broken window staged to fool us, a door locked to create the illusion of impossibility." She met the widow's gaze, but the fatal mistake was believing no one would see through the illusion. Lady Rosalind let out a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp, and suddenly, all the pieces fell into place. Lord Everleigh recoiled, Dr. Mowbray muttered something under his breath, and Mr. Harland, who had been clutching his glass of brandy, set it down with an unsteady hand. The room, once thick with uncertainty, now pulsed with the weight of inevitability. Rosalind's breath came in shallow bursts. "You don't understand," she whispered hoarsely. "I had no choice. He was going to ruin us. I had to stop him." Charlotte nodded, but there was no sympathy in her gaze, only quiet certainty. And yet, the truth has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how cleverly it is buried. The room seemed to shrink, pressing inward as Rosalind's trembling hands rose to cover her face. Inspector Adler, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his voice like the closing of a door. "That will be all, Lady Rosalind." And just like that, the game was over. Inspector Graves took a slow step forward, his shadow stretching long across the floor of Blackthorn Hall's dimly lit study, the scent of old parchment and dying embers heavy in the air. The gathered suspects stood in uneasy silence, their faces pale, their postures tense, waiting, dreading what was to come. At the heart of the room, seated with a stillness that bordered on eerie, was Lady Helena Redgrave, her gloved fingers tightening around the arms of the velvet chair. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but her eyes, cold, sharp, and unyielding, gave away what her silence did not. "The game is over, Lady Helena," Graves murmured, his voice low yet carrying a weight that made the chandelier above seem to sway. "You've played your part well, but the truth has a way of bleeding through even the finest of veils." The assembled guests stirred, their glances darting toward one another, suspicion and realization swirling like storm clouds. Graves turned, his eyes sweeping over the others, his tone edged with finality. Lord Redgrave's death was no accident, nor was it a crime of passion, a simple act of rage. He paused, letting the tension coil tight. No, this was meticulous, methodical, planned. A single strangled breath left Lady Helena's lips, but she remained composed. It was Miss Davenport, the ever-watchful governess, who finally whispered, "But how?" Graves allowed himself the hint of a grim smile. "The bell rope," he said, eyes locked onto Helena's. "A simple mechanism, one that could be manipulated from outside the room. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a locked study, and a man left gasping for breath, poisoned by a hand unseen." A ripple of horror coursed through the room. Lord Redgrave had been found slumped over his desk, the door locked from within, the windows latched. It had seemed impossible. Until now. Poison, delivered through the very thing he trusted, Graves continued, his own evening brandy. But that wasn't enough, was it? He took a measured step toward Helena. "No, you needed it to appear. Impossible. And so you staged it. You ensured that when the bell was pulled, it would drop the vial into his drink, seamless, undetectable." The gathered guests gasped, their disbelief warring with the realization that it all made sense. Graves' voice dropped to a whisper. "You needed an alibi, so you made one. A public quarrel days before, hints of discord, so no one would suspect you would still play the dutiful wife, delivering him his last drink." A slow tremor passed through Lady Helena, but still, she did not speak. Graves exhaled, shaking his head. "You did it because he knew, didn't he?" The silence was unbearable now. Graves pressed on. "The money, the secrets buried in the foundation of this very house. He uncovered something he shouldn't have, perhaps an affair, perhaps something darker." His gaze sharpened. "And you couldn't allow that." Lady Helena finally lifted her chin, her voice a mere breath. "He would have ruined everything. A confession, bare and unvarnished, stripped of pretense." The weight of it settled over the room like dust in the lamplight. Graves inhaled deeply, the case now laid bare. There were no more secrets to conceal. Justice, cruel yet unrelenting, had finally arrived at Blackthorn Hall. The heavy silence in the drawing room of Ravenshade Manor was shattered only by the steady ticking of the grand oak clock, its pendulum swinging like the slow heartbeat of a house that had witnessed too much. Inspector Harrington stepped forward, his voice low but edged with finality. "Margaret Ainsley," he said, his tone firm, though not without a note of sympathy, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Lord Edwin Blackwell. You will be taken into custody and charged with his death." A sharp, strangled breath left Margaret's lips, her fingers clenching the folds of her gown as if grasping at something, anything, to hold on to. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet laden with desperation. "Please, you don't understand. I never meant to." But there was no escaping the truth now. The weight of her confession had already sealed her fate. Harrington took a slow step closer, his hand resting on her shoulder, his touch neither harsh nor gentle, just inevitable. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Margaret," he said, his voice quieter now, "and the law will always demand its due." Across the room, Miss Evelyn Harrow watched in pensive silence, her keen eyes never leaving Margaret's trembling form. She had seen this moment unfold countless times before, the reckoning, the collapse, the burden of guilt manifesting in shudders and gasps. Murder was never as simple as the act itself. It was the web of desperation and deceit that led to it, the quiet unraveling of a person who had convinced themselves they had no choice. As Margaret was led away, the air in the room grew heavier, as if the manor itself was exhaling the secrets it had kept locked within its walls for far too long. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching in the flickering light of the dying fire, swallowing the grandeur of the space, and leaving only the weight of what had transpired. Miss Harrow sat, her gloved fingers resting against her chin as she traced the final strands of the mystery in her mind. The order of things had been restored, and yet, a deeper unease settled in her chest. Justice had been served, but justice, she knew, was never as clean as people wished it to be. The society that had once whispered of honor and truth had rotted from within, twisting itself into the very thing it had sworn to protect against. And now it would live with the stain of its own undoing. Later, in the quiet refuge of her study, Miss Harrow stirred a spoon through her untouched tea, her thoughts still lingering on the events of the evening. Across from her, Mrs. Hathaway, her old friend and confidant, sat in contemplative silence, her hands wrapped around a delicate china cup. People, she murmured at last, her voice thoughtful, are capable of the most terrible things, aren't they? Even the ones you think you know best. Miss Harrow's gaze flickered toward the fire, the glow casting flickering patterns along the polished wooden floors. Deception, she said softly, isn't always a matter of intent. Sometimes it's simply survival. Mrs. Hathaway exhaled slowly, shaking her head. I suppose that's the hardest part of it, isn't it? We live our lives believing we understand people, only to find that truth has a way of shattering all our carefully built illusions. Miss Harrow's lips curled in the faintest hint of a smile, one that held no warmth. Perhaps, she mused, but the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And as the fire crackled softly, illuminating the quiet corners of the room, Miss Harrow knew that though this case had come to an end, the world would always be full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The rain lashed against the windows of Ashworth Hall, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit, yet inside the dimly lit study, the silence was heavier than the storm outside. Inspector Calloway stood by the fireplace, his sharp gaze fixed on the trembling figure before him. "Annabel Hargreaves," he said, his voice a measured balance of authority and finality, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Lord Reginald Ashworth. You will be taken into custody and charged accordingly." Annabel's breath came in shallow gasps, her gloved fingers tightening around the edge of the mahogany desk, as if she could anchor herself to the world that was now crumbling around her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice." But Calloway had heard those words before, countless times, a desperate plea, a last-ditch effort to undo the inevitable. He took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "There is always a choice," he said, quieter now. "And you made yours." Across the room Evelyn Graves observed in silence, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp as ever. She had seen it all before, the breaking point, the unraveling of lies woven too tightly. Murder, she knew, was never just an act of violence. It was a web of desperation, deception, and fear, spun so intricately that even those caught in its threads failed to see it for what it truly was. Annabel had been convinced she could outmaneuver the truth, but the truth, as always, had a way of slipping through even the smallest of cracks. As the constables led Annabel away, her figure disappearing into the rain-drenched night, Evelyn turned to Calloway, her voice measured. "The Ashworth family was never about honor," she murmured. "Only power, and power when threatened will do anything to protect itself." Calloway exhaled, his jaw tightening. And now that power is gone, but they both knew better. Power never truly vanished, it only changed hands. Later, in the quiet warmth of her drawing room, Evelyn sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows along the walls. Across from her, Beatrice Harcourt wrapped her hands around a cup of tea, her usual lively demeanor subdued. "People are capable of terrible things, aren't they?" Beatrice murmured, staring into the steam rising from her cup. "Even the ones you trust." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She had long since stopped being surprised by the cruelty people could justify. "Deception isn't always intentional," she said at last. "Sometimes, it's just survival." Beatrice let out a slow breath. "Still, it makes you wonder. We live our lives believing we understand the people around us, and then, the truth shatters it all. Evelyn allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Perhaps, she mused, but the truth always comes out in the end, no matter how deeply it's buried. And as the fire crackled, filling the room with its quiet warmth, she knew that though this case had reached its end, another secret was always waiting just beneath the surface.